Welcome to the Terraform and IaC practice series from the AI Mock Interviewer Question Bank. Terraform and IaC Part 1. This episode has 15 questions. For each question, take a moment to think through your own answer before I share a strong approach. Question 1. Terraform or IaC? Terraform expert. How would you design reusable Terraform modules for GCP networking, IAM, GKE, Cloud Run, observability, and security so teams can consume them safely? Here's a strong way to approach it. Design modules around a well-defined, minimal interface, clear required inputs, sane defaults for optional ones, that encodes your organization's best practices internally, so consuming teams don't need to know the low-level GCP resource details to use them correctly. Version modules semantically so teams can pin to a known stable version and upgrade deliberately. Keep security-sensitive defaults, like private by default networking baked in rather than opt-in, and provide example usage and validation rules so misconfiguration fails fast at plan time rather than after apply. Nice. Let's continue. Question 2. GCP services. Compute engine operations. A Linux VM behind a load balancer has high CPU, many time-wait connections, and intermittent TLS errors. How would you debug it? Here's a strong way to approach it. High CPU plus many time-wait connections suggests the VM is opening far more short-lived connections than it can cleanly close. Check whether the application or a misbehaving client is not reusing connections, missing keep alive, and consider tuning net IPv4 TCP/TW reuse if genuinely needed. Intermittent TLS errors alongside this pattern often point to the VM running out of ephemeral ports or file descriptors under load. Check SSS for connection state counts and file descriptor limits, and correlate CPU spikes with TLS handshake volume to confirm the causal chain before changing kernel parameters. Great. Moving on. Question 3. Security or DevSecOps. IAM Recommender. How would you use IAM Recommender and audit logs to reduce overpermissioned service accounts safely? Here's a strong way to approach it. Use IAM Recommender's suggestions, based on actual permission usage over the lookback window, as a starting point, but cross-reference with audit logs to confirm a permission genuinely wasn't used before removing it, since Recommender can miss infrequent but legitimate uses. Quarterly jobs, disaster recovery paths. Apply reductions in a lower-risk environment first, monitor for breakage after applying in production, and prefer removing to a slightly broader than minimal role initially rather than the absolute narrowest, iterating down further once confident. Alright, next question. Question 4. Automation or platform. Developer experience. How would you measure whether your platform improves developer experience and delivery speed? Here's a strong way to approach it. Measure concrete, comparable metrics. Time from code commit to production deployment. Time to provision a new service from scratch. Percentage of infrastructure needs met via self-service versus tickets. And developer satisfaction via periodic surveys correlated with actual usage data. Track these over time and by team so you can see whether platform investments are actually moving the numbers, rather than relying on anecdotal feedback alone. Let's keep going. Question 5. SRE or reliability. Capacity incident. A regional capacity shortage affects node pool scaling. How would you mitigate and redesign for resilience? Here's a strong way to approach it. Immediate mitigation means shifting load to a region or zone with available capacity if the architecture supports it, or requesting a capacity increase or using a different machine type that has availability. For redesign, reserve capacity ahead of need for critical workloads. Committed use or reservations. Design workloads to tolerate running across multiple zones or regions so a single region shortage doesn't block scaling entirely. And build alerting on capacity trends so a shortage is anticipated before it becomes an incident. On to the next one. Question 6. Networking. VPC service controls. When would you use VPC service controls? What problems does it solve? And what operational pain can it introduce? Here's a strong way to approach it. Use VPC service controls when you need to prevent data exfiltration from managed GCP services, like someone copying data from an internal BigQuery dataset to a personal GCP project. by creating a security perimeter around resources regardless of IAM permissions. It solves a real gap that IAM alone doesn't cover, but it introduces operational pain when legitimate cross-perimeter access, a partner integration, a new internal service outside the perimeter, breaks unexpectedly and requires explicit bridge rules or access levels to fix, which can be a slow, easy to misconfigure process if not planned for upfront. Good. Here's another one. Question 7. Terraform or IaC? GKE multi-cluster. When would you use multiple GKE clusters versus one shared cluster? And how would you handle traffic, identity, policy, and operations? Here's a strong way to approach it. Use multiple clusters for strong isolation requirements, regulatory separation, blast radius limiting between critical and non-critical workloads, or true multi-region active-active, and a shared cluster with strong namespace isolation when the isolation needs are softer and the operational overhead of managing many clusters outweighs the benefit. Multi-cluster requires a strategy for cross-cluster traffic, multi-cluster service mesh or a global load balancer, consistent identity, a shared workload identity or IAM approach, and centrally enforced policy, config sync or Anthos config management, so clusters don't drift into inconsistent configurations. Nice. Let's continue. Question 8. GCP services. BigQuery or data reliability. How would you approach BigQuery or data pipeline reliability when platform teams own infrastructure but data teams own pipelines? Here's a strong way to approach it. Define a clear ownership boundary. The platform team owns the underlying infrastructure reliability, BigQuery slots or reservations, network, IAM, monitoring infrastructure, while data teams own pipeline correctness and SLAs for their specific datasets, with a shared on-call escalation path when it's unclear which side an issue belongs to. Provide data teams with self-service observability, query performance dashboards, pipeline slot tracking, so they can own their reliability without needing platform team involvement for every issue, and establish a joint review process for changes that cross the boundary, like a reservation resize affecting multiple pipelines. Great. Moving on. Question 9. Terraform or IaC? Terraform state basics. Explain Terraform state and why it is important. Here's a strong way to approach it. Terraform state is a file, local or remote, that maps the resources declared in your configuration to the real infrastructure objects Terraform created, tracking metadata and current attribute values. It's important because Terraform uses it to determine what needs to change on the next apply, define desired config against last known state, and without accurate state, Terraform cannot reliably know what already exists or safely plan updates without risking duplicate or conflicting resources. Alright, next question. Question 10. Terraform or IaC? Terraform remote state. What is remote state, and why do teams use it? Here's a strong way to approach it. Remote state stores the state file in a shared backend, GCS bucket, Terraform Cloud, instead of a local file on one developer's machine, so the whole team works against the same source of truth. Teams use it to enable collaboration. Everyone's plans or applies see the same current state. State locking to prevent concurrent conflicting applies, and to keep sensitive state data out of version control while still being securely accessible to CI or CD. Let's keep going. Question 11. Terraform or IaC? Terraform state locking. How do you handle state locking? Here's a strong way to approach it. Use a backend that supports native locking, GCS with a lock mechanism, or Terraform Cloud or Enterprise, so that when one operation, plan or apply, is running against a workspace, a second concurrent operation is blocked rather than racing and potentially corrupting state. If a lock gets stuck, e.g. a crashed CI job left it held, Terraform Force Unlock can release it manually, but only after confirming no other operation is genuinely still in progress. On to the next one. Question 12. Terraform or IaC? Terraform count versus for each. What is the difference between count and for each? Here's a strong way to approach it. Count creates n nearly identical resource instances indexed numerically, 0, 1, 2, which can cause unwanted resource recreation if the list order changes since instances are tracked by index for each iterates over a map or set of strings, tracking instances by a stable key rather than index. So adding or removing an item in the middle doesn't cause unrelated resources to be destroyed and recreated. For each is generally preferred for anything beyond simple, order-independent repetition. Good. Here's another one. Question 13. Terraform or IaC? Terraform modules. What are modules, and how do you use them for reusable infrastructure? Here's a strong way to approach it. A module is a reusable, self-contained set of Terraform configuration with defined input variables and outputs, letting you package a common infrastructure pattern, like a standardized GKE cluster setup, once and reuse it across environments or teams by simply calling the module with different inputs. This reduces duplication, encodes best practices centrally, and lets you version the module so consumers upgrade deliberately rather than everyone maintaining their own copy-pasted configuration. Nice. Let's continue. Question 14. Terraform or IaC? Terraform environments. How do you manage multiple environments such as dev, staging, and production? Here's a strong way to approach it. Use separate state files or workspaces per environment, either Terraform workspaces, or better for isolation, entirely separate directories or backends per environment so a mistake in dev can never touch production state. Share common logic through modules with environment-specific variable files, dev vars, prod vars, supplying the differences, keeping the underlying infrastructure pattern consistent across environments while allowing appropriately different sizing or settings. Great. Moving on. Question 15. Terraform or IaC? Terraform import. How do you import existing resources into Terraform safely? Here's a strong way to approach it. Write the Terraform resource configuration to match the existing resource's actual current settings, then use Terraform import, or the exact commands and code are in the written question bank. Alright, next question. That wraps up this episode. Nice work practicing, and see you in the next one.